this? I don't know. It's me. It's Amid the Ruins. It's a guy who makes dire wave music. It's Amid the Ruins. Dire wave music. What I've talked about in, probably 100 articles at Jay's Analysis is the implementation of the AI smart grid and the giant smart cities, which is what IBM talks about publicly building. And that's where we're going, and that's what I think we have to be really concerned about. So all of these tensions, they are part of a long-term strategy to basically get everybody moved into mega cities. They'll be forced off of land and so forth for environmental reasons, and basically concocted and invented environmental nonsense. Then you'll be stuck in some hellhole mega city in a, basically a carton-sized apartment living over a Target or something, or inside of a Target or a Walmart, as I said several years ago. It's actually coming true now. There's actually Target cities. This is all part of the long-term globalist strategy. So, but to get there, you've got to have the constant clash, the constant alchemical blending and mixing and smashing together right out of Manichaeanism to produce the convergence, to produce the synthesis. And that's what's crucial in all this, and what is absolutely true from an alchemical, esoteric, philosophical, and geopolitical perspective, the fact the ruling elite seek to be post-human. jaysanalysis.com. can't try to fix today's problems politically. And this is what so many people in alt circles and alt-right and alt-whatever and alt-media, they all seem to think that there's like a political solution to man's problems. And really the whole of modernity is built on this neo-pagan concept of political salvation. And there is no political salvation for man, because man's problems are not essentially political, they're spiritual. Hierarchy of how man views himself in the world has been inverted. I've covered over and over and over the white papers that actually discussed how to invert and subvert that, changing images of man, things like this. So what has to happen is that the inversion has to be reverted back to the way it needs to be. And that means that first and foremost for man, it is spiritual issues. Those come first. Then we have the things like the philosophy and the family and the social issues and things like that. That comes next. And race or ethnicity can be classed as part of that. That is, in other words, you caring for your people is just a broader extension of the family, the tribe, the nation. Right? It all depends on what we mean by these words and these terms. Now, America and Americanism is the first attempt at a completely propositional nation. And this is well known. This is not debated in political theory. I think even Abraham Lincoln referred to it that way. Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis. Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis. What's up? Welcome. We haven't done a heated, in-depth philosophic stream in a long time. Can everybody hear me before I start yapping a lot? I want to make sure I can be heard. I want my voice to be heard, y'all. Do you want your voice to be heard? I bet you do. Now, where is my slow boy whiteboard? We gotta have a whiteboard for the slow boys and the few slow girls out there. What's up, slow girl? How you doing, slow girl? Where'd I put my dang whiteboard? Well, dang it. I can't do this talk without my whiteboard. White boy? Yo, white boy, where's your whiteboard at? It never ceases. Always drama. There's more drama today. Fact. I apologize. I gotta find this whiteboard or this ain't gonna work. All right. Whiteboard discovered. Whiteboard found. It was hiding in a bunker with Joe Biden. We're going to get it back. It's on top of the fridge. Thank you. I thought today what we would do is cover tonight, not today. We're going to cover the typical objections to tag. I've been a tag proponent for 20 years. I know it very well. And in that 20 years, I've heard a lot of the same objections, replies, critiques over and over and over, probably hundreds of times. So we kind of concurred. Meeting of the minds today in the Discord. Shout out to all the Precept gang, all the boys. And we tried to come up with a list of the top 10 objections that we always hear that are pretty easy to diffuse and discard and to get rid of. So for those that don't know, it might be helpful to set out a little bit of a background to what we're arguing, where this comes from in the history of philosophy, and how we get there. So this is going to involve some of the categories of Aristotle. It's going to involve then Kant's appropriation and modification of the categories of Aristotle. And then pointing out how we're not Kantian. Okay, we're not making Kant's argument per se. So there's a difference between transcendental arguments and the transcendental argument for God. And in fact, that's one of the common misunderstandings and objections is transcendental arguments don't prove God. Well, if you mean by transcendental arguments the kind of transcendental arguments that Kant does, you're correct, because they're not arguments for God's existence. So there's first and foremost a distinction between the transcendental argument for God and Kant's transcendental argumentation. So that's the first just really obvious mistake that people make. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, nerds, to the chat. If you do have super chat questions, feel free to link those through the Streamlabs. I will be answering the Streamlabs questions and those alone. And I did a talk a year ago responding to a really in-depth critique of Tang, right? What about Michael Martin's argument, Tang, the transcendental argument for the non-existence of God? How do you reply to that? Well, I'm not going to rehash that, and that's not even one of the top 10 objections. Hardly anybody even knows about that objection. But I already did a 2-hour stream on that, 2.5-hour stream last year. So when this stream is done, I'll link the Tang response later. But now we've put many videos out, including that one. Church of the Eternal Logos has done a great video outlining, the basic transcendental type of argument. As you know, I kind of modify. There's a lot of different types of transcendental arguments you can do for God. I kind of modify mine, as you all know, to include the entire Christian paradigm and the insights of Maximus the Confessor to deal with universals and things like that. So we'll get into some of that tonight, but let's deal with the first objection, which we're going to say, this is why I brought this up in the recent debates and talks that we've had. So we're going to make a distinction between two types of arguments, two types of logical statements, you could say. And we'll call these lower order logic versus higher order logic. That would probably be the easiest way to categorize it. You'll hear me at times refer to kind of common claims, normal claims, but I'm going to go ahead and say, let's talk about higher order and lower order logic. So if we have normal propositions that are made, like the tree is green, whatever, we can those kinds of statements, then we move them to propositional logic, right? That's a higher order. That's a step up. So, for example, the tree is green is a lower order statement than X is Y, because now we're moving into a more higher formal type of statement, right? Or all X are Y, right? What we're doing in a transcendental argument is just kicking the bar up a step, right? We're moving up a little bit higher and saying, well, what has to be the case for that? So it's an even higher order, meta, you could say, level question. And that's where we get into the necessary condition, or necessary preconditions, you could say. So here, and if you go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, when they give the example of transcendental arguments, this is the one that they always use. It's the one I used in the debate. You can go see that we've constantly pointed this out. Father Deacon Dr. Ananias' paper that we often direct people to, it just lays this out, right? Because it's the most easy way through disjunctive form to see what a transcendental argument is. And as you can see, when you compare it to these lower order claims, it's just a higher level, more powerful type of statement, right? So it comes before in the order of logic, you could say, as a precondition for these kinds of statements. Now, there are perhaps some people who might take issue with this, but typically speaking, this isn't objected to. There's nothing about X is the necessary condition for Y, Y, therefore X, that's invalid. Now, we know that the atheist is going to take issue with our plugging God into this. We know all that. But we just want to point out that all we're trying to demonstrate here at the outset is that this type of a claim or statement is of a higher, deeper, more powerful, use whatever analogies you want, order of statement than this. And in fact, these are more fundamental and powerful than these, such that if you deny this, this isn't possible. See how that is? In other words, for me to make these kinds of statements, I have a whole bunch of these kinds of statements or beliefs already assumed. So this is where we get into what we call preconditions or transcendental types of categories. Now, Aristotle does not flesh out the notions of necessarily preconditions, right? He doesn't have this really abstract Kantian style of precondition transcendental arguments. But if you have basic works of Aristotle, you'll know that the very first work is the categories, all right? And the categories, according to Aristotle, it's kind of commonsensical when you think about it. Aristotle lists in his 10 categories, and he just kind of comes up with 10. He says there is substance, quantity of that substance, the quality of the substance, the relation, the place, the time, the situation, the condition, the action, and the passion. And so he has a 4-part system that then overlaps those 10 categories. So there's another important section that I would call your attention to. You don't even have to understand all the ins and outs of Aristotle to understand just kind of the basic ideas of what we're dealing with here if you're new to this stuff. And it's Aristotle's book 4 of the Metaphysics, chapter 4. In that section, Aristotle just posits a kind of reductio where he says that if you deny logic, you're using logic to deny it. And so he says that logic itself is proven by reductio. All right, if you were to be a sophist and you argued against logic, said, Aristotle, how do you know logic's true? You would be assuming logic in the denial, and that would be a reductio. So therefore, normally speaking, we don't get sophists who question logic itself, but if we did get one of those guys, we could refute them thus in that section. Now, this is going to bring us to, again, just kind of understanding the course of the debate over the centuries, right? To help us understand what we're talking about when we talk about transcendental categories or presuppositions. We're going to get through the 10 objections here. We're going to start those here in a minute. Now, when Kant, we have to understand that Kant is situated within the context of reading Hume. So Kant reads Hume. He writes this book. I'll show it to you. It's called The Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. Okay, and he says, you know what, everybody, I've read David Hume, and Hume has really smashed metaphysics as a possible science, or as the undergirding of science, and therefore we're going to have to respond to Hume in order to be able to do metaphysics or philosophy proper ever again, right? So Kant correctly understands the import of the dilemma that Hume has put everybody in. This is why Hume and Kant are so important for us as proponents of transcendental argumentation. It is not because we are Humean or Kantian. Let's make that very clear from the outset. We are not Kantian. We are not adopting the philosophical autonomous man project of Kant. We are not Humean in the sense that we are accepting his radical skepticism. We are pointing out that on the skeptic's grounds, on the empiricist school of thought grounds, we're not justified in any of the claims, leaps, science, induction, etc., 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 that we do. That is what Kant is saying here. Kant is saying we're going to have to answer Hume. We're going to have to answer the synthetic a priori dilemma if we're ever going to be able to do any future metaphysics. So Kant thinks, Kant's right as to assess what the issue is. He's right to propose using transcendental arguments as a way to reply. But Kant has a fatal flaw in his response, which is the assumption of the phenomenal noumenal distinction that we can never get to the exterior world. We can never know that the sense data is presenting us with the thing in themselves. Okay? And so therefore, Kant's project fails, not because of transcendental arguments, but because he makes the whole project situated in the mind. The individual human mind becomes the schematic organizer of the sense data. The mind, in Kant's view, is like, imagine it like a 12 sectioned ice cube tray. The sense data that comes in to the ice cube tray is like the water coming into and being given form and organization in this 12 schema ice cube tray. What is the schema? For Kant, it is the time-space medium by which we bring in the sense data that the mind as the ice cube tray organizes. The 12 spots in the ice cube tray for Kant are his version of Aristotle's categories. Does that make sense? So even though what we're saying kind of sounds abstract, it's actually, if you think about it, it's not that difficult. So for example, Aristotle, I'm going to read just a brief intro level statement about this. Aristotle claimed that the following 10 predicates or categories could be asserted of any object in general. Substance, quantity, relation, right? The things that we read before. The categories of Aristotle and Kant are the general properties that belong to all things that don't necessarily express any particular object. Okay? So far, no problems. Pretty clear. Any object, however, must have the categories as a precondition for the possibility of knowing those objects. Okay? So in order to know about an object in your sense experience, it's going to have these relations or these qualities or these categories like, what are the ones we listed? Aristotle's were unity. No, wait, that's Kant's. Aristotle's were substance, quantity, quality, relation, place, time, situation, condition, action, passion. Now, Kant doesn't think that this is the best list. He kind of tweaks this list. And he gives what he calls a table of judgment, right? So he puts these into a different kind of ordering system. But it's the same basic idea. The categories do not provide knowledge of individual particular objects. Any object must have these categories as a precondition, right, for the experience or for the knowledge of those objects. It is presupposed or assumed that anything that is a specific object must possess the categories as its properties because categories are predicates of any object in general. Now, Kant is correct in looking at types of things and saying that we need this for metaphysics to be possible, right? I mean, Aristotle's metaphysics is all premised on these kinds of things, yeah? But Hume is saying none of that can be proven from sense data. And Kant's like, okay, Hume, we can't respond to that if we start with sense data. So Kant's problem is rather than looking to revealed theology to answer these dilemmas, to smush all of this into the human mind. In other words, in Kant's system, the problem is not transcendental argumentation, but rather the smushing of what the divine mind does for us as theists into a finite human mind. Doing this undermines the entire project because you don't actually know that anything out there in the external world is the case. You don't know if other minds operate like the mind that you think is operating in this way, right? Kant might study his own phenomenal mental states, but he doesn't know if other minds work this way by the very fact that he can never get beyond the phenomena. This leads to a school of philosophy called phenomenalism. And centuries after this, you'll have people who admit we can never know objects in themselves. And since we can't, we'll just study the phenomena as they appear to us. Phenomenology. Anyway, all of that was just to say that we're not interested in Kant's autonomous humanist project. We're not interested in transcendental idealism. We're not transcendental idealists. So, but transcendental arguments have a life outside of Kant. They're not restricted to, they don't begin with Kant or Van Til. Right? The form of the argument can go back to Aristotle. And so, as you can see, one of the objections that we'll deal with, that this is all Calvinism or Kantianism, completely fails because the arguments have nothing to do with the people who make the arguments, because the form is valid. So that's the first thing that we wanted to understand, is that what are we talking about when we're talking about transcendental categories or preconditions? So as you saw, what we're saying is these categories, Kant puts them like, for quantity, he has a universal and a particular, right? And that the mind makes judgments about these states. For quality, affirmative or negative. For relation, categorical or hypothetical. For modality, problematical or asoretic. Right? So it's similar to what Aristotle was after, but Kant gets really kind of like specified about it. He's like, Aristotle's categories weren't good enough. We need better, more. And I'm not saying Kant's right in all this. I'm just saying that the basic principle here is correct. That what we're looking at, and there's other types of things too, like Kant talks about, for example, that in order to have perceptions, there has to be a perceiver. So there has to be some kind of transcendental unity of apperception, he calls it, which is just to say that there's a self. There's some self that undergirds the incoming sense data that gives them meaning and perceives them. That self is obviously not the subject of empirical sense data. So, next what we want to do, we want to see why this is such an important, crucial debate and issue, is we want to be familiar with what's called the Peripatetic axiom. The Peripatetic axiom is basically the position of Aristotle that will be 100% adopted by Thomas Aquinas. And it really is the root of the whole problem, right? When we covered this in part 2 last night, we saw that Phaser never grasps the actual critique is of the Peripatetic axiom itself. In other words, if you're going to be an empiricist, you need to be consistent. What is the Peripatetic axiom? Nothing is in the intellect that is not first in the senses. Right? It is found in De Veritate of Aquinas, question 2, answer 3, response 19. Aquinas adopts this principle from the Peripatetic school of Greek philosophy, namely Aristotle. Aquinas argued that God's existence could thus be proven by reasoning from sense data, and he used this variation of the Aristotelian notion of the active intellect, which is interpreted as the ability to abstract universals from the empirical sense data in front of you. Now, what all Hume is doing, if we want to understand the project of Hume, very simply, is just to point out that if you're an empiricist, a strict empiricist, and Hume is saying, all you guys that want to start with sense impressions, all you guys that want to start with the Peripatetic axiom, if we are going to be consistent, then none of the things that we believe in that are these categories or principles or powers or energies or entelechy or whatever, telos, causation, all of these Aristotelian things, act potency, principle of sufficient reason, all these different categories that you could, or principles that you could come up with, they're not immediately under the purview of sense data. Hence, Hume's argument, billiard ball A hitting billiard ball B, you're not actually perceiving causation. You're perceiving event A, event B, and you're calling that causation. Where in the sense data, where under a rock, where in a microscope do you see causation itself? You don't. Therefore, none of these things can be proven empirically. It's a very simple premise and a very simple presentation. It's not that complicated, not that difficult. So after Hume, you have centuries of philosophers simply trying to respond to this, all the way up until Quine. Go into the Discord, read Father Deacon's paper. What is Father Deacon's paper? Is epistemology naturalized really epistemology? This is his analysis of W.V.O. Quine's Two Dogmas of Empiricism. And it just simply says that, look, Quine admits that we are, and nowadays, centuries after David Hume, still stuck in the problems that Hume presented. If we are sufficiently skeptical, then we can't justify the principles upon which science is based because they're non-empirical. It's a very simple argument. So they cannot be justified. Quine argues, let's just give up the project of rational justification. Just give it up. And now it will be merely the project of psychologism, right? Now philosophy will just be the study of mental states. We're just going to be pure rank psychologists. Hence the term psychologism. Because what else are we left with? You can't justify these things, obviously, right? None of these things themselves are empirical. And the whole system is collapsing because of the fact that it's built on the peripatetic axiom. Right? So all Hume is doing is saying that if nothing is in the intellect that isn't first in the senses, then God is never in the intellect because God is never in the senses. Telos is never in the intellect because telos is not in your sense data. Causation is not in your sense data, right? And subsequent philosophers for many centuries will just eviscerate all the assumptions of empiricist philosophers, right? For the next several centuries, all the way up to modern day Wilfrid Sellars and people saying that it's even worse than that. There's a myth of the given that objects are just given to us as if we could just pick out one sense data to start with, as if that one picking out of sense data that we're going to start with as an empiricist isn't part of a lexicon or web of beliefs that we have. Obviously. And so the whole project is laughable and ludicrous. And then you've got Thomists and people living in the Middle Ages like this hasn't been critiqued for the last several hundred years. They don't even understand what they're replying to. Anyway, so let's get to the first mistake. Now that we've grasped what we're talking about when we're talking about preconditions, right? We're talking about things like the self. We're talking about categories, right? We're talking about things like universals, particulars. We're talking about abstract concepts. We're talking about relation. We're talking about time, space, placement, you could say, okay? We're talking about unity and quantity. We're talking about distinction itself, okay? These are predicates of objects that are necessary as preconditions for the possibility of experiencing objects. What else did we say? We said Aristotle's were substance, quantity, quality, relation, action, affection, place, time, position, and state. Kant modifies those, comes up with 12. We're not going to spend too much time focusing on Kant. It's not that big of a deal. Because what we're getting at here is just that these things have to be the case, okay? Now, when we ask, how do you prove those things? This is where transcendental argumentation comes into play. Because what do you mean by proof? Do you mean by proof give a physical proof of that? I mean, a rank empiricist type of person literally means, yes, give me physical proof of immaterial types of things like preconditions or universals or whatever. Well, that makes no sense. And that's what we call the crackers in the pantry fallacy. Because the type of thing that we're arguing for, if it's immaterial, is obviously not going to be proven in a material way. And everybody already admits and believes this. Nobody believes that everything is demonstrated or proven in the same way, right? You don't prove whether or not water boils at 100 degrees in the same way that you prove a really abstract math problem, right? So that's equivocating on the notion of proof and in what sense and how we prove different types of things. So you're not going to. It's impossible to prove something abstract and immaterial by necessitating that it be proven in an empirical material way, right? From the outset, that moves the goalpost to where it's impossible to do the thing that you're trying to do. It's like the atheist saying, for example, prove to me immaterial objects in a material way and I will believe them. It's already limiting the types of proof that he will allow by metaphysically saying, I don't accept anything immaterial unless it's material. You see, it's very simple. So, what has come to be the case in terms of argumentation that I think refutes a lot of these mistakes is transcendental arguments, right? The same way that we're going to prove these types of preconditions, since they're immaterial, is by the impossibility of the contrary. That is what Kant does, right? Kant makes this move. He doesn't think they're true of the external world, which is self-defeating. But regardless, the idea that you got to have these preconditions to have knowledge is clearly true, right? I mean, if there isn't logic, meaning, these kinds of things, then you can't have knowledge of anything, right? I mean, having knowledge of something in some way presupposes things like a knower. It presupposes the ability to have knowledge. It presupposes some concept or some notion of knowledge itself, right? I mean, all of these things are prior to, right, knowing objects. So we're not talking about any particular object yet. We're talking about what has to be the case for the possibility of knowing objects. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about preconditions. So when we list those preconditions, that, as I've said, and I think that there's more than, I mean, Kant includes universals and particulars in that, but I mean, I think you can include other things too, like the self. These things also kind of are assumed in any knowledge act, you could say. None of those things are under the purview of empirical data, but they're assumed in the process of empirical sense data. You see? So let's deal with then the first objection. Now that we've understood what type of thing we're doing here, the way that we're doing it. And by the way, I'll remind you that my version of tag is we'll have a 3-step process to my version, which is, as you know, one, we have knowledge claims, right? Knowledge claims presuppose are based on preconditions. The things that we're already talking about, the categories, etc., all these different things that are assumed for knowledge to be possible or to be the case. And then when you bundle all the preconditions together, you need a specific type of thing that grounds, justifies, and makes coherent and explains those preconditions. And that's God in our argument. Now I'm going to flesh the argument out before you atheists have a meltdown. I know you're not going to immediately accept that. I'm going to flesh this out. But I'm saying that this is the 3-step process that I'm going to do in my argument. Right? I'm going to say that all knowledge claims are predicated on preconditions. The types of things that we've talked about, Aristotle's types of categories. They're the preconditions for the possibility of experience. They're not experiences themselves per se. They're the preconditions for the possibility of experience. Again, remember at the beginning we talked about lower order and higher order, right? This is lower order. We're moving it up to higher order, the preconditions. And I'm going to include things like universals, abstract objects. Then when we look at all these, as we saw, if you watched the last lecture, Fazer has one good chapter in this book, chapter 3, where he makes an argument that these things, he doesn't talk about preconditions, he talks about universals, but these things, including universals, interlock. If these interlock and necessitate one another, they do, then we need something even higher, a third higher order of justification that justifies them. Now, an atheist could conceivably say, well, what's going to justify this? In this system, this is the final reference point of justification in this whole paradigm, right? In the Orthodox paradigm, there is no higher justification than God himself. God is the ultimate transcendental. He's the ultimate circularity. Right? There's no other reference point beyond him. And you say, well, how do we know that? Because the system itself dictates that, right? So this circle here is not just an abstract conception. It's not just an argument about God or an idea. It's the entire paradigm. So this is why I'm not going to argue the argument just on the basis of a conceptual scheme, because that's one of the objections we're going to deal with in a minute. My argument, my version of this argument, is the entire Orthodox paradigm, which is part of the argument for God, right? Including everything that we believe as Orthodox. That is the ground and the basis for the preconditions, which are the ground and the basis for any possibility of knowledge, any knowledge claim. Now, I know that right now that's not going to necessarily convince people, but as we go through the objections, hopefully it will be a little clearer what exactly we're saying. So the first objection is, this argument doesn't prove anything, it's an assumption. Now, as we saw, this is a tripping up on the word proving. It's related to the crackers in the pantry fallacy, as Bahnsen correctly called it, which is just to mistakenly assume that everything is proven in the same way. If you saw the Matt Dillahunty debate, this is what Matt did. Matt said, proving something is an empirical demonstration, a scientific demonstration, or a mathematical logical demonstration. Except that even Matt and Malpass and other people admit that not everything is proven in the same way, right? So if we admit that, then the way that we're going to argue for and prove God is not going to be the same as the way that we argue for and prove material objects, right? Because God is not a material object. God is not an object of sense data. God is not a thing. So the way that he's argued for or proven will not be like the way that we prove things that are not like him. The way that we go about proving him will be more like, not identical to, but more like the way that we argue for universals, abstract concepts, math in itself, mathematical entities, the laws of logic, or transcendental preconditions. That does not mean that God is identical to math, or that he's identical to logic, or that he's identical to universals. It's just saying that the way that we argue for that type of a thing is similar to the way that we're arguing for those types of things, the abstract entities. And by that, I don't mean that God is an abstract entity, right? We don't say that. So what we're looking for then in this kind of an argument at what we're calling a higher order paradigm level. So when you hear me talking about paradigm level arguments, I'm meaning the same thing as higher order logical argumentation, meta level stuff. That's all we mean. And you can make the analogy higher order or more foundational. It doesn't matter either way. It's making the same point. So what we're looking for is, I would argue, a paradigm has to be coherent, it has to have explanatory power, and it has to have justificatory force, right? So these three things are involved in reasoning for or convincing people of a paradigm. So you can't just say, well, I come up with a mental scheme that is a perfect math algorithm that explains everything, so therefore I don't have to believe in your God, because I could come up with a mentally coherent math world that's coherent, but you see, therefore tag isn't true because you don't believe in the perfectly coherent algorithm, right? You believe in a God. Well, that might have some degree of coherence, but that's not all that we're asking for in terms of a worldview. Remember when we had the objection from some of the atheists that I can come up with a universe that is at one molecule. There's nothing contradictory about that. It's coherent, and therefore you can't prove tag if there is that as a possible world. That fails not because of coherent. First of all, I don't think that's coherent. But even if it was, it doesn't have explanatory power for this world and the paradigm that we're arguing for in this reality. And it doesn't have any justificatory force at all. So it completely fails in terms of what we're looking for in justifying, explaining, and making coherent a paradigm. The one molecule universe, the one atom universe, or whatever, the fictional world of JF where there's a computer on a planet spitting out algorithms that's not incoherent, is not a justification of paradigm level questions. It's not an explanation, and it's not coherent. So that's the first objection that we want to deal with, is that your argument doesn't prove anything. It's merely an assumption. It's not merely an assumption. It's an argument. It's an argument from the impossibility of the contrary that is about an entire paradigm. if the argument was something like, God exists and therefore God exists, right? That would be circular. It wouldn't do anything. It wouldn't prove anything. It wouldn't be a very good argument. It would just be a restatement. It would be circular, right? It doesn't tell us anything. Rather, the argument is, in the domain of ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology, what we're going to call the most basic level of paradigm, only the Trinitarian Orthodox conception of God can give a coherent, justificatory, and explanatory power to the basic assumptions of those three things. That's the argument. Okay? And because all those three things go together, they interlock, right? Not just the preconditions, but the preconditions in these three domains of philosophy or a paradigm or a worldview. Because they interlock, they cannot explain themselves. They have to be grounded in something that's even higher order. That's our argument. Now, you may disagree with that as an atheist. I'm sure you will. But let's at least understand that that is the argument first. Because I think 90% of the time, they don't even understand what the argument is. And that is the argument. So, the objection that it doesn't prove anything, it's just an assumption, is missing the point that it's an argument at the paradigm level. And so, therefore, it does prove things at a paradigm level. And we showed in the first 20 minutes on what basis we are arguing for something that's normal language or lower order language, natural language, versus something that's higher order. So, objection 1, dispelled. Objection number 2. This is a circular argument, bro. And circular arguments are invalid. Now, if we were classical foundationalists, we would agree. We would have to say, yeah, dude, circular arguments are invalid, unless we're at the paradigm level where they are unavoidable. For example, arguments about words. How can you define or prove that words have meaning without using words? You can't. How can you describe or define or explain numbers without using other numbers? You can't. And so those are examples of things that at a certain level, there's no lower or higher order things that you could appeal to, right? Because they become self-referencing. So this is why, for example, remember what we said about Hume earlier. Hume says, you guys who affirm the peripatetic axiom that nothing is in the intellect that's not first in the senses, you're inconsistent, because I want you to show me in the sense data where any of these abstract things that you appeal to are. You can't do it. You have to assume the thing that you're appealing to, right? And if you assume the thing you're appealing to in a foundationalist scheme, as an empiricist, you're being circular. Now, as proponents of the transcendental argument, we're admitting, yes, it's unavoidable. At a certain level, at a certain point, all arguments become circular. How can you argue at a meta level for anything without being circular? How can you argue for the status of logic itself, the logic of logic, without being circular? You can't. What does Gödel's incompleteness theorems show? Circularity, right? It's impossible to avoid. So this argument that it's circular, bro, is missing, again, the point that the argument is about truths, beliefs at the preconditioned, presuppositional paradigm level, not about normal language or lower order logic or claims or natural language. And by extension, we can include the really low-level argumentation or mistake that this is all Kant and this is all Van Til. That's like saying that all the church fathers are Aristotelian because they use arguments that Aristotle used, right? That's a genetic fallacy. It doesn't matter whether Van Til made a million transcendental arguments or never made any transcendental arguments. It has absolutely nothing to do with whether transcendental arguments themselves are valid or invalid. And as I said earlier, we are not adopting Kant's humanist project. So it has nothing to do with Kantianism, right? As if the person who says, as if syllogisms are only valid because Aristotle said them, or invalid because Aristotle said them. I mean, nobody believes this. This is ridiculous, right? And especially when the Thomists come with this stupid objection where they say, this is all Bahnsen and Van Til. Oh, really? You guys are obsessed with St. Aristotle. Give me a break. All right, thank you for those super chats. We'll be getting to those here in a minute. But I'm going to hold off for the main objections to the very end. This one is related to the main objection at the very end, which will be, how does it prove the Trinity or Jesus? We're going to save that for the last objection because that's one of the most difficult. But maybe a more general version of this objection is, look, dude, the transcendental argument might show preconditions, right? But it doesn't prove God, okay? It doesn't prove any kind of higher order thing beyond the preconditions. Now, I'm going to direct you, I know you don't have this book, but if you didn't hear the talk that I did the other day from chapter 3 that's public, go listen to the talk that I did on universals, right? Because Phaser's one good chapter in this book is the chapter on universals. And what he talks about in that chapter is, look, when we try to consider universals, you could also look at Father Deacon's argument that he gave on the immateriality of abstract objects, right? That you could prove this even from strict Boolean argumentation, right? Even with no existential import, you can show that speaking of an entire set of objects cannot be identified with material physical objects, right? Which, if you go read his paper, watch his video on that, he argues that just strictly in terms of set theory, you can show that it's not the case. That you can't reduce any universal to any particular physical. But more specifically on the ontological issue, what Phaser does is show in many, many arguments that abstract objects, universals, numbers, laws of logic, concepts, possible worlds, propositions, truth values, all have to have some type of existence, and maybe we're not even going to say what kind yet, we don't know yet, that cannot be identified or reduced to states of matter. Okay, none of those things are coherently, isomorphically reduced to or identified with or encapsulated by pure matter or physicalism. And in fact, we run into all kinds of basic self-refuting nonsense when we reduce universals, possible worlds, words and predicates, preconditions, even science as a methodology, the principles of science, or concepts to physical matter. It's really stupid and self-refuting. And so we get to the fact that words and language, there's an essay by Frege, Thought, where Frege makes the argument that even language and communication has a whole host of transcendental types of preconditions that are necessary, that have to be the case for even to have the possibility of communication. Okay, that's a higher order question than examining some instance of communication. Right, so you and I were having this instance of communication through the computer, right? Frege would say, before you can even have that as a possibility, there's all these things that have to be the case. You see? Very similar, very same type of argumentation that we saw with Kant. What are the preconditions for the possibility of communication? Just applying the same argument to a different type of thing. And so in this chapter, he will go on to make multiple types of arguments based on Frege, based on argumentation of St. Augustine in terms of divine conceptualism. Now keep in mind, this is key because my version of tag is a divine conceptualist version of tag. So just keep that in mind because we're going to have to locate these universals and all of these things somewhere. We can't locate them in the finite human mind, can't locate them in matter, But they got to be somewhere or somehow. They must be somehow or somewhere. They must have some kind of existence in some way that allows them to continue to be, irrespective of states of matter and time and space and flux, because they don't change, right? And let's use an argument from Leibniz here. Caesar crossed the Rubicon. That's an argument, that's an event that happened in history. And we're going to say for the sake of argument that it did happen, right? It's not made up or something. So Caesar did cross the Rubicon. If I were to write out that sentence, isn't it the case that no matter what happens in history or in the future, nothing's going to change the truthfulness of that proposition, right? It's never going to not be the case that Caesar crossed the Rubicon, right? So this is called the argument from the eternality of truth from Leibniz, that you can't equate propositions or the truth value of propositions to matter or to physicality, because physicality, matter, it's always in flux. But even the truth value of that sentence will never change. It's never going to not be the case that happened. And since that's the case, obviously these kinds of objects, abstract objects, numbers, right? 7 coconuts is not identical to the number 7. It's the same point being made, right? That's all we're saying here. So, Feser's excellent argument in that chapter is that these types of things don't operate, and you've heard me make this argument. That's why I'm at least going to give Feser a lot of props for making the argument that I make there, which is, again, Augustinian and Leibnizian. Yes, it is. Which is that all of these types of things are interlocking. Universals, possible worlds, words and predicates, indirect argumentation, laws of logic, concepts, right? These types of things don't just exist in a vacuum. They can't just be momentary figments of the human mind. Where are they? What are they? This is why we need some type of omniscient, omnipresent mind that grounds and interlocks them, you could say. There's no other options, you see. Now, I know you're going to say, oh, well, this doesn't prove the Christian God. We'll get there. That's going to be the last objection. But right now, we're just dealing with the objection that you can't move from the preconditions to God. But what I'm arguing, and by the way, Feser doesn't exactly talk about preconditions. He almost kind of does when he talks about Frege's section about what's necessary for thought and communication. That's pretty much what we're talking about here, right? We're not just saying Kant's categories only relate to the mind, though. They relate to the mind and the world, right? So we're affirming a kind of realist position we're saying that a form of realism has to be the case. We're not going to argue for Plato, but we're saying that there is some kind of realism that with all of these types of objects, which don't exist in a vacuum, they interlock, as Feser says. There must be some form of divine conceptualism that makes them coherent and cohere amongst themselves, that gives them explanatory power and gives them justificatory force, right? They don't change into the opposite of themselves. Why not? Because they're grounded in the divine mind. The divine mind is invariant. It's immaterial. It's omniscient. It's universal, right? It's everywhere. God's mind's not over there. He doesn't lack facts, right? So the omnis are a great point that we want to bring in to show that that's how we ground these objects. Now you say, well, I don't buy that, right? We know, atheists, we know you don't buy that. But what we're showing is that our paradigm can give a coherent explanatory justification for these things, how they are, where they be, how they do, what they is. Okay? That's what we're saying. Now, you say, but that doesn't prove it. Again, we're comparing two paradigms. The atheist paradigm in this example versus the paradigm that we just gave, right? You may not like this, but this paradigm that I just gave of the divine mind grounding these universals, showing how they interlock, how they relate to a world separate from God, etc., etc., etc. This is giving a coherent explanatory justification. The atheist paradigm, by contrast, can't even get off the ground. Not only can it not give a justification, the materialist atheist perspective, as an example, has no explanatory power, has no coherence. It cannot even explain how these objects are even possible. It negates the possibility of knowledge at all. That is the argument, you see. The comparison of two rival paradigms is the argument. That's what the atheists, the opponents, even the evidentialist apologists, even they don't understand that that's the argument. So let's move on to the next objection. Let's move to the evidentialist apologist, right? Cameron Soituzzi, or whatever his name is. These kinds of guys. Yo, it doesn't prove anything. You guys are just like removing evidences. That's totally a misunderstanding. In fact, evidences have a very important place in the apologetic. We don't put them in the wrong position, though, right? We don't put evidences ahead of the best arguments that we have. That would be foolish. And it's very easy to show that evidential apologetics is a complete failure, because it just assumes the very things that Hume calls out that are not answered, right? What did Sellers say about the myth of the given, right? How do you have access to an epistemically privileged position? You don't. Nobody does. And since nobody does, right, if we're classical foundationalists and evidentialist apologetics is based on classical foundationalism, there's never going to be any way to follow through the peripatetic axiom and justify the things that they believe in without appealing to the things that they believe in. But that whole system, evidentialism and classical foundationalism, is built on the belief that you can't do circular arguments, right? So again, circular arguments are both valid and invalid in different cases and in different situations. In first order natural language, first order logic, lower order logic, it's invalid to make circular arguments. This is the basic mistake of T-Dump the other day. But at a higher level, they're unavoidable. That's the point. And that's the point that the evidentialist doesn't understand, you see. So all we have to do to refute Stefan is the same thing that we would do to refute the evidentialist apologist, I'm saying. Which is to say, as Hume said, you guys are inconsistent. And you also are allowing things that are not as certain to be the starting point for what should be more certain. In other words, if God exists, God is more certain than the laws of logic. God is more certain than any of these abstract principles that you are appealing to, right? Because he's the ground of those things in the Christian paradigm. So how are you going to use things that he's the ground of as if they were more certain than him, and then say that God's existence is 98% certain, 95% certain? So mathematics is more certain than God's existence. What a stupid argument. All any smart atheist has to do is point out that you've already conceded your point, because now the real God of your system is logic and math are more certain than God. And if that's the case, then your God is not ultimate. This is the stupidity and folly of evidentialist apologetics. It's literally trying to argue stuff that has been refuted 500 years ago. And all you have to do is read David Hume, understand the peripatetic axiom can't be proven, it has to be assumed. So it's circular. So either admit circular arguments or give up your foundationalism. And And let's look at the other boxes that the empiricists will be stuck in, right? What did I list? If you look at the debate with Stefan is an empiricist just as much as the evidentialist apologist is an empiricist. Most of the time. And I said, Stefan, if you're an empiricist, how are you going to avoid? This applies to Aristotle. It applies to Aquinas. It applies to every evidentialist, every classical theist, and every classical foundationalist. You will never get out of these boxes. The myth of the given, the problem of the external world, the problem of induction, the status of immaterial objects, and that there's no properly basic beliefs. You can't solve those things without appealing to those things. And if you do, that's circular, and you're no longer a classical foundationalist because you don't believe in circular arguments. It's actually pretty simple when you understand the strength of Hume's critique. And the low IQ people are going to be like, "You're Humean. You're just David Hume, dude." No. David Hume's argument has nothing to do with David Hume. I'm not Aristotelian because I'm using an argument from Aristotle. I'm not Van Tillian because I'm using an argument from Van Til. Doesn't matter. It's just really low level objections. Thank you for those super chats. So feel free to continue that. We got 260 live tonight. Welcome, everybody. We're covering the top 10 bad objections to tag that are all based on misunderstandings and low-level slow boys. When the slow boys come out, dripping that drool off of that chin, trying to respond. Wipe that dribble, boy. So that's how we would respond to the evidentialist. The evidentialist is in the exact same boat as the Aristotelian, the Thomist, the classical theist, the classical foundationalist. They've not responded to David Hume. And when Fazer writes his book, he never responds to David Hume's central critique of the peripatetic axiom itself on its own grounds. On your own grounds, how do you know that the only thing that is in the intellect is first in the senses? That principle itself cannot be proven from sense data. But if you start with sense data, you're going to have to prove that from sense data. It's very simple. And Father Deacon's paper that we've cited and linked a million times makes the same point from all the places in Aristotle where Aristotle begins with basic empirical sense data. Guys, come on. You got to have a better apologetic. That's why Cameron, by the way, when I asked Cameron to debate, Cameron Soituzzi, I said, let's debate when IP backed out, when they said, oh, you're too mean. We're not going to debate you. You're too mean. I said, Cameron, what training do you have? What is your degree in? He said, photography. I mean, I meant, what is your philosophic training, right? He says, photography. Exactly, right? No wonder. And I was going to try to apologize and make up with Cameron because I would like to be on good terms with him. But, I mean, he literally thinks Matt Dillahunty won our debate. That's how soy this guy is. I mean, he literally can't grasp what a presuppositional argument is. They think that it means that you don't do evidences. Bro, the transcendental argument is an evidence. It's the ultimate evidence. It requires evidences. This is just like basic misunderstanding. And they don't want to talk to you. They're not interested in trying to understand this stuff. All right, so the last objection was the evidentialist claim. They're stuck in the position of Hume. They don't understand the critiques of Hume, and that we all ultimately rely on circular argumentation at a certain level. It's unavoidable. Next, let's deal with the argument. I think T-Dump made this one. The laws of logic are made up, dude. They're contingent. They're just things that we invent. They're social constructs that work. This one is really, really laughable. I mean, who actually believes that the laws of logic are made up? Who believes that Mandelbrot sets are made up, right? If you do any reading on that subject, what's immediately apparent is that there are a whole host of really complex mathematical things that many mathematicians, engineers, and even scientists will speak of as discoveries. Mandelbrot sets are just the easiest way to disprove this, because we couldn't really lay them out until we had computers that had the processing power to demonstrate the insane level of patterns as we zoom in or zoom out to, these really extreme depths. So what that shows right away, very simply, is that a Mandelbrot set is an example, like everything else in mathematics, that is discovered. It's not invented. It's not made up. It's discovered. And who actually thinks that? I mean, think how silly this is. I went out and I noticed. I lifted a rock and I found the laws of logic there. Really? Obviously not. When something like laws of logic or really abstract things are worked out or argued, they're discovered. And their truth value, as we saw from the Leibniz argument, is not contingent upon any material thing. And all of these objects that we've talked about, the abstract objects, numbers, laws of logic, universals, by definition of what they are, they do not have the properties of variance and flux, materiality, temporality. They're not restricted to any area in space and time, right? Let's invoke once again Leibniz's argument of the eternality of truth. That alone disproves this stupid argument, right? Will it ever not be the case that Caesar crossed the Rubicon? So it's universally the case that truth value will never change, no matter what happens in the physical flux world. 7 coconuts does not equal the number 7. Obviously. So we can easily dispense with that really low IQ, stupid objection. Next, let's get a little more sophisticated. So the we're getting more and more. That was the last of the low IQ objections. Let's get a little more sophisticated here with, wait a minute, dude. Your argument doesn't prove a Trinity. Your argument proves perhaps some kind of mental God or some abstraction. Maybe there's like a universal computer, or we're in a simulation, and the simulation includes within its programming transcendental categories. Now, on the surface, this kind of sounds like a good objection, right? It's similar to the argument that we heard earlier that I can come up with a universe that's coherent, and therefore your position doesn't work. But my argument wasn't premised merely on coherence. The argument was premised on coherence and explanatory power and justificatory force. We were saying that was included in what we expect of a worldview or a paradigm. The worldview or the paradigm needs to show that in ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology, there's coherence, explanatory power, justificatory force. That is the argument. So the claim, well, how do you prove a Trinity, and why not Odin? Right, this is where it gets funny, because you'll get the guys that are like, well, dude, what if I just took every one of your metaphysical things, the grand metaphysical structure of your worldview, and I just stick in Odin, dude? Gotcha. Well, there's a problem with this. First of all, this whole system is not based on abstract speculation. It's based on revelation. We believe and defend what is revealed. What is revealed is the triune God, not Odin. Okay? That's what we're here to defend. So that metaphysical structure that we have as our inheritance from our church fathers, from Maximus, John Damascus, the Cappadocians, all these Christian philosophers who give us our grandiose metaphysic, that happened in history. That comes down as a deposit, part of our paradigm, part of the deposit of our revealed faith, you see. So you can't bastardize, copy, and paste all of that into Odin. It doesn't work. And by the way, as I said earlier, evidential arguments have their place. I can bring in evidential arguments at this point because I'm going to say my worldview is what's revealed in Scripture. The Old Testament predicts in probably 150 plus places the coming Messiah. It says nothing about Odin, right? Remember, we're not arguing for a mere conceptual scheme, some mindscape. We're arguing for a God who stepped into time and space. We're arguing for the whole Christian paradigm, including the doctrine of creation, including the incarnation and redemption, including the history of the church. That's all part of the paradigm, you see. So at this juncture, it is valid to bring in historical arguments, evidential arguments, right? When I start saying that there's all these prophecies about Christ, that's part of my paradigm. That discounts copy and paste with Odin. And by the way, nobody believes, if you were to literally start, just think how silly this would be. Odin is the second person of the Godhead. Odin stepped into time and space and became incarnate and died 2000. Nobody believes that. That doesn't work for you. Nobody believes Odin is a ultimate unity and triad reality. No, that's not. So it's obvious that this type of argumentation is purely theoretical and actually just copy and paste bastardizing the Christian metaphysic. So it doesn't work. So you say, why a Trinity? One, because it's revealed. Just simply put, our ultimate circularity and the point where our argument stops is revelation. We can't go any more fundamental, any more meta than that. That's the ultimate meta. That's the ultimate stopping point, the ultimate foundation, the ultimate presupposition, the ultimate precondition is divine revelation. And this relates then to you have to disprove every worldview. No, I don't. Because this is, again, a mistake. That was the first mistake, right, of not understanding higher order and lower order argumentation. When you confuse those two, that's when you might think, I have to disprove every single worldview. No, all I have to do is disprove, given what my argument is. So don't straw man my argument. If you want to deal with my argument is that every worldview has basic assumptions in ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology. You're very limited in the number of steps you can go in each one of those domains. For example, is reality created or uncreated? Right? Is it eternal or does it have a beginning in time? Is knowledge possible or impossible? Is there an external world or not? Are there objective ethics or not? So I can structure a bunch of either ors, and every step that the theoretical opponent takes will determine the rest of that system down the road, down the line, right? So for example, if my opponent says that, as most of these people do, knowledge claims are purely relative, ethics are relative, okay? Those are really strong claims that will determine the rest of that worldview. I mean, that's pretty much a dead end box right there. And that's most people, right? But as you can see, you are actually very limited. There aren't very many. I mean, I could even boil it down to one thing or many things. Is reality ultimately one or many or both? You're limited in those options. And in fact, most religious worldviews out there, most of them, are either monist or dualist. So when we understand that this is actually how worldviews function, that every worldview by necessity can be boiled down to very limited either or starting points. There's not an infinite number of worldviews. The variations in worldviews are down the line. Let's give an example. Most worldviews, as we said, are monist or dualist. If you have basic presuppositions in your metaphysics of monism or dualism, that's going to condition pretty much everything else in the rest of the worldview in a lot of ways, right? For example, everything is one, man. Let's use monism. That's going to condition and necessarily determine the way that I view knowledge claims. I'm not going to turn around and be like, well, everything is one, but I'm a distinct being who has knowledge. No, I'm also part of the one. Right? So monism, pantheism, these are very strong determining forces in the paradigm when we make those kinds of statements, when we have those kinds of views. Now, granted, a lot of people are inconsistent, right? So they're not always going to be consistent. But that has nothing to do with the fact that a person believes, for example, that all reality is one, but I'm a distinct individual. That's inconsistent. That doesn't mean that he actually has a unique worldview. He doesn't. There's countless people who have this goofy, inconsistent worldview. So I could take it in either direction. I could say, well, if everything is one, then you're part of the one and you don't actually know that you are a distinct you. So that's a fundamental contradiction, right? That's pretty obvious, right? So there's a limited number of steps that anybody could take. There's not an infinite number of worldviews, literally. You could boil it down to something or nothing, right? Basic metaphysical things, right? Do things exist or not, right? I could just list any number of really easy either ors that will determine where you have to go in your worldview. And every worldview of necessity has some limited number of steps that it can go in any of those basic kinds of questions. It's unavoidable. And literally, that's all I have to do. Now, why is that? Because reality is structured a certain way. For example, everybody will be forced to use basic concepts like unity, duality, multiplicity, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 10. There's no other ways that we do and describe things than those types of things. This will lead into our argument later, right? So everything is classed in terms of one thing distinct from other things. That's unity and multiplicity, the one and the many, right? And all of the numerals are classed under one, two, three, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. If we have the Arabic numeral system. 10. Let's take something like the Tetractys as an example. When we have this basic numeral system, any type of distinctions or categories that we make of things are going to involve these basic 10 principles. It's unavoidable. Unity, distinction. Distinction requires two, a dyad. A dyad leads to a triad, right? Now you're going to say, yeah, but we don't all accept Pythagoras. We don't all accept that there's a Tetractys. I know that there are theoretically other systems and other types of geometry. I know all that. But for human predication, the possibility of human predication, what did we just say in Aristotle and Kant? What do we have? We had unity, universality, particularity, distinction, quantity. Any type of predication of quantity, of unity, distinction, particularity, one and many, must use this type of system. You must use unity, duality, distinction, many. It's unavoidable. 1, 2, 3 are universally basic and necessary. They're unavoidable. There is no possibility of predication that is meaningful that does not use 1, 2, 3. I am distinct from you. 1, 2. When we start building up from that, that's many. 4, 5, 6, 7, a billion. Okay? to say that object is red, that cat is on the mat, the cat is green on the mat. The picking out a specific cat, cat picking out a specific type of thing that shares in catness, that is singular from a universal, one among many. Number is being brought into this equation. Do you see this? One cat amongst many cats. Unity, distinction, two, dyad. Now, even Far Eastern philosophies, amazingly, were able to pick up on the fact that these universal principles like one and two, unity, dyad, are all pervasive. They underlie language, thought, reality, the natural world. And so, as you could see, you could see why they would come to think that reality itself is some kind of mystical tension of dyad. Hence, yin-yang, right? Opposing forces. Night, day, male, female, black, white, 1, 0. Yeah, yin-yang, constant dialectical tension, push and pull of all reality, right? This is what characterizes all Far Eastern philosophies, okay? Now, and you can see why they would think that, because they're looking at the world, they're looking at these different types of things, numbers even. If you go back to the Bhagavad Gita and this kind of stuff, they're looking at these higher order principles, and they're saying there's ultimate unity and there's ultimate this, that. So they would come up with answers like everything's one, everything's two, or it's all just chaos flux, right? There are different types of options you give. You see the Greeks doing the same type of thing. Everything's fire, everything's water, everything's permanence, everything's flux. Oh, it's all just chaos, atoms in motion, right? Atomism, whatever. The point is that all of these descriptors and universal narratives are still utilizing universal categories that require ultimate unity and ultimate distinction, or the principle of distinction itself. That's dyad, you see. This is how we're going to get to Trinity in a minute. But I'm just trying to show you that anytime we predicate, remember Aristotle's substance, quantity, quality relation? Substance, one thing. Quantity, one thing, maybe two things, three things. Quality, type of thing, relation, next to that thing. This thing next to that thing, relation, two things. And from two, you build up to three and on to everything else. So all numbers are collapsible into 1, 2, and 3, and the first 10. And what I'm saying is that it doesn't matter about other theoretical mathematical systems. I'm not even debating that. I'm just saying that for communication and the preconditions that we mentioned earlier, whether Aristotle's preconditions or Kant's preconditions, some of those preconditions are things like quantity, which require unity and division or distinction or dyad. And from dyad, you get all the others, you see. That's why we're going to make the argument next, which is that Trinity is unique because Trinity, as Maximus will say, surpasses the dyad. What if we just said God's a unity? What if we just said God is a dyad? I'm going to read a few quotes here that I think adequately explain why this doesn't work. First quote comes from the excellent book of Vladimir Lossky, Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church. Then we're going to look at Staniloy, and then Maximus, and then the Orthodox philosopher I. M. Andreev, Orthodox Apologetic Theology. So here's the argument that Losky makes, which I think is good. He says, in the spirit of St. Gregory of Nazianzus, we will speak of his oration on baptism. St. Gregory says, no sooner do I conceive of the unity or the one when I am illumined by the splendor of the three. No sooner do I distinguish them that I am carried back to the one. When I think of any other than the one, I think of the three. I think of him as the whole, and my eyes are filled, and the greater part of what I am thinking of escapes me. I cannot grasp the greatness of the one so as to attribute a greater greatness than to the three. When I contemplate the three, I see but one torch, and I cannot divide or measure out the undivided light. Our thought must be in continuous motion. This is Losky. Pursuing now unity, and then pursuing once again threeness, and then returning again to the unity. I must swing ceaselessly between the two poles of the antinomy, right? One or three. In my human mind and all of our human minds, it's still an antinomy. Keep that in mind, antinomy. In order to attain to the contemplation of the sovereign repose of the threefold monad, however, is what we're after. He says, I'm still stuck always in this antinomy when I'm trying to have the sovereign repose of the threefold monad. How can the antinomy of unity and Trinity be contained in any image? How can the mystery be grasped, say, by the aid of an idea, be it that of movement or of development? St. Gregory Nazianzus' conscious adoption of the language of Plotinus here can delude only those who are unimaginative and pedestrian in their souls, who are incapable of rising above mere rational concepts, those who ransack the church fathers for traces of Platonism or Aristotelianism. Rather, St. Gregory Nazianzus speaks to the philosophers as a philosopher, so that he might win philosophers over to the true contemplation of the triune God. Quote, the monad is set in motion in virtue of its richness. The dyad is surpassed, for the deity is above matter and form. So dyad is usually predicated or universalized from dyads in nature, two-ness, matter, and form. Right. This was typical in St. Gregory Nazianzus' day, is that dyad is a fundamental feature of matter, is what Maximus and Gregory Nazianzus will say. Whether that's the case, that can be debated, but regardless, we'll come back to that later. So he goes on to say, the Godhead does not dwell within bounds, nor does it spread itself indefinitely. The one would be without honor if it were soul and if it were alone, right? If we just had a soul hypostasis, a singular hypostasis God. This would be a wholly, quote, Judaic notion. And if we had an ultimate triad or only threeness without unity, we would have Hellenism. Now, remember what we saw in Basil, in the phaser talk. What does Basil say about Aristotle's prime mover argument? Basil says that it necessitates, if you really believe in actus purus, the unactualized actualizer, then God has to eternally actualize and move something outside of itself, Phaser says, namely eternal prime matter in Aristotle's argument. So Basil says actus purus is stupid as a defining character of God because it means that God must have an eternal matter to move. That means that matter is now eternal and takes on a divine character, or property or attribute, namely eternality. Now you have a two-headed God. You have the eternal prime mover and prime matter that's his eternal complement. Now you're a dyad. So you see how easily the eternal monad becomes the eternal dyad. And this is true actually of any of the philosophical systems that might restrict God to a single hypostasis. If he's God and Lord from all eternity, what's he God and Lord over? If he's eternal mover, actus purus from all eternity, what's he eternally actualizing and moving other than himself? Oh, eternal matter, eternal worlds, eternal creation. Really? So now you have a two-headed God. God and the world, the eternal world that he's moving. That's Basil's argument, Hexameron 2. Read it. Read it, Thomists. It's not your view. you don't believe what Basil says. Now, I'm situating this within my larger argument about monad, dyad, triad. I'm just pointing out that very easily a single hypostasis God can collapse into a dyad because he has to have a creation eternal over which he's Lord. For the word God and Lord to be sensible, right? This is partly what Origen argues. But now let's get back to triad, monad, dyad, triad. Losky goes on to say, we gain a glimpse of the mystery of number 3, that the deity is neither one nor many, right? So we're saying that God is not identical to unity or multiplicity. The divine perfection goes beyond the multiplicity of which duality is the root. So here's why we don't believe in a dyad, right? Monad, dyad, this is multiplicity. This is division. This is to move from unity to distinction, right? All number will originate from, as I just said earlier, unity to duality, right? All numbers then extend from that. We recall then the dyadic systems, the interminable dyads of the Gnostics and the Platonists, right? These dualisms are, he's basically saying that they're untenable. All the dualistic systems of the Platonists, same stuff I just showed you in the Aristotelian argument, those are untenable. They're stuck. Thus, we need something that moves beyond the dyad of division and distinction to transcendence and perfect triunity. And Losky says, when we express ourselves in terms of number here, the divinity has no need to manifest its perfection per se to itself or to others. God is the triad, the Trinity, and this fact can be deduced from no principle or explained by any sufficient reason. For there are no principles or causes or sufficient reasons anterior to the Trinity. You hear that, classical theists? Do you hear that, classical foundationalists? Triad is the name which unites and things... Triad. The name which unites things united by nature, and it never allows those which are inseparable to be scattered by a number which separates, namely by 2. Gregory Nazianzus says, 2 is the number that separates and divides. 3 is the number that transcends separation. The one and the many find themselves gathered and circumscribed ultimately into the Trinity. That's why it can't be an ultimate hypostatic singular God. That's why it can't be a dyad. It has to be transcended in the triad. When I say God, Gregory says, I mean Father, Son, and Spirit. Godhead is neither diffused beyond these so as to be introduced a multiplicity of gods, nor is it yet bounded by a smaller compass than these so as to condemn us for the poverty-stricken conception of deity in monotheism, be it Judaizing or be it Hellenism. St. Gregory of Nazianzus is not seeking to vindicate the Trinity of persons before human reasoning. Rather, human reasoning is grounded in the Trinity. We must ask then whether the idea of number can be applied to God, whether we do not thus submit divinity to some exterior determination or to a form proper to our understanding, such as the number 1 or the number 3. To this objection, St. Basil says, we do not count by addition, passing from one to another to the many to increase. For we do not say that 1, 2, 3, and then we add a third. I am God, the first and the last. He's just saying that God is beyond the created conceptions of numbers and numerics. We are not equating God to the number 1 or to the number 3. Now we have never, even at the present time, heard of a second God. We adore God of God, confessing the individuality of the 3 hypostases, and we dwell in the monarchy without dividing the theology into fragments. In other words, there is no question here of a material number which serves for calculation and is no wise applicable to the spiritual sphere, where there is no quantity or increase. The threefold number is not, as we commonly understand it, a quantity. God does not possess quantity. When it relates to the indivisibly united divine hypostases, the sum of which is always the unity. 3 is always 1, and 1 is always 3. It expresses the ineffable order within the Godhead. The contemplation of this absolute perfection, this divine plenitude, which is the Trinity, the God who is personal and who is not a single person confined within himself, we see a pale shade of the Trinity. When we consider human relations, this is going to lead us to the next insight, which is from Maximus. Maximus commenting on the exact same section. This is in Questions and Doubts. For writing of this, Gregory of Nazianzus says, this is Maximus commenting on Gregory, the Trinity is perfect. It is the monad having been moved on account of multiplicity, and dyad, which is through matter and form, from which bodies exist, having been transcended, being defined as triune or triad on account of perfection. For it is the first that transcends the composition of the dyad. So, we don't believe that God possesses any composition. We don't believe that God is a pure unity or a dyad. And so the only option is triad. And Maximus comments on Gregory. He says, Gregory does not give us the cause of being of the divine blessed Trinity. So he's not trying to say that this is how God came to be. That is beyond cause and beyond reason. Rather, Gregory is giving us the cause of our being, that we are led by the hand to the most truthful reverence of the triune God. For just as we understand the author of existence from the essence of beings, so also we are mystically taught the mode of existence of the most ineffable divinity from some symbols found in existing things. That is to say, the holy divinity itself moves us into an acknowledgement of itself and provides pious starting points in order for us to have the courage to examine the mode of God's extraordinary existence. And so it is said to be set in motion. So in other words, he's talking about the movement from monad, dyad, triad, right? We're not talking about a temporal movement. The setting in motion is the logical order of how we're understanding 1, 2, 3 in the Trinity. That's all he's saying. It is the cause of our movement in terms of our knowledge of it. It moved itself in us towards the knowledge of him by the things that exist, he's saying. So the monad having been moved and the dyad being transcended is not something that happens in time and space, right? It's outside of time and space. It is said because the divine nature is perceived to exist outside of any composition or outside of any time. And thus, being defined as Trinity on account of perfection, it is said because being itself is not without wisdom and life. Wisdom and life being the Son and the Spirit. God being the Father here identified as being itself, the Son being wisdom, Spirit being life. Understanding that's from the 150 chapters too that Gregory Palamas covers this. Understanding this, we recognize wisdom as the Son and Logos of God, and the Spirit as life. Therefore, our soul, which is created in the image of God, is a little Trinity, is also observed to have nous, Logos, Spirit. Maximus is saying that we see trinities, little triads in nature. These suggest to us the highest level triad, Father, Son, and Spirit. And he's saying that there's a movement that is of necessity and limited, not a physical movement, but a movement from monad, dyad, transcended by triad. Now, how does this prove our God? How do we know that? 2 more quotes. Next, we're going to move to Staniloy. Staniloy is going to make a similar point that Andreyev is going to conclude with. This is page 73. In the communication of divine life, St. Cyril of Alexandria attributes a special role to the Holy Spirit. He communicates to human nature, first of all, the power to receive subsistence in the person of the Word, who overcomes the laws of an endlessly repetitive nature. But the spiritual force exists only where there is full communion. The Holy Spirit then communicates to human nature the power to rise again by a new conquest of the laws of nature. The Holy Spirit communicates this spiritual power because he is the Spirit of communion. Full communion exists, moreover, only where duality is overcome. If one person who does not communicate being loses the certitude of existence by being lost within nature, two persons likewise risk being submerged in a monotony or in nature through an exhaustive, closed, selfish communion between the two. Only in the existence of a third person does it make it possible for the maintenance of a continual freshness for each of the three persons, as well as for any possible pairing of the persons. It is only in the existence of three in the triad that they do not become confused with one another, nor are they totally separated from one another. Only a third person maintains distinctive unity, breadth of love, etc. between two persons who can change as partners. Thus, the movement that we're talking about from the Father through the Son and the Spirit, this eternal communal movement, eternal manifestation of the energies, right? The Father eternally loving the Son and the Spirit. It is only in overcoming duality that life is thus truly rich, and in God, infinite and limitless. Christ receives the Spirit as man because as man, he is received into the perfect communion of the triad. So through him, we too might be received into triune communion through grace. Lastly, we will look at Andreev, the argument that he makes on this same point. He says, even though there are in both the Old and New Testaments general dogmatic truths, nevertheless, the truths of the New Testament are more clear and deeply and spiritually rooted and free from elements that we find in the Old Testament under the veils, right? The symbolism of the Old Testament. So things are made more manifest, more clear in the New Testament. That's all he's saying. Some revealed truths in the Old Testament were expressed more covertly. In some of the more spiritually developed Old Testament, people were forced to ponder these things, such as the mystery of the Trinity, which is indicated in the Old Testament, right? We see the Word and the Spirit mentioned in the Old Testament. He says the Old Testament prophets were revealed. They revealed the Son himself, right? Present-day Hebrew scholars unjustly affirm that the Old Testament had no indications of the Trinity. In fact, the Trinity, as you know, we've discussed it many times, indicates the Trinity in many places. But it is impossible not to see in the Old Testament an undisclosed understanding of the special powers of God, the Word of God and the Spirit of God. The appearance of the triune God to Abraham and the three visitors, etc. Now he's going to talk about strict monotheism. The essential point in the Christian teaching about God is that the revelation of the dogma of the Holy Trinity preserves the inviolability of the Old Testament teaching of God's unity and adds in a special new insight a highly ethical character which was not clear in the Old Testament, nor could it have been present in any other system of monotheism. Then he goes on to say, the blessed Trinity is what is unique here. Strict monotheism witnesses very little to the purity and loftiness and ethical worth of the religion that is preaching it. For you can imagine for yourself some religion of the pre-Christian antiquity, talking about Greek philosophers here, talked about a highest level of unity, a highest being, etc. But it still is inefficient because whether it's Plato or Aristotle, these monotheisms either turn into pantheism, dualism, or barren deism. Only Christianity, through the disclosure of the dogma of the Trinity, has given a solution to the timeless question of the nature of the one God in himself. Only Christianity discloses the truth that God, in his essence one, has definite realities of existence outside of his relationship to the world. All right, this is back to the Aristotle issue. That is, he is tripersonal. And since he is tripersonal in the eternal fullness of his inner life, from all eternity, it is unknown to us, but it exists apart from the world. In other words, God would eternally be in a perfect triune communion, whether he had created the world or not. Therefore, he's not dependent on the world. not explaining the very essence of the mystery of the Trinity, this essence-energy distinction. The dogma of the Trinity clarifies for our mind something concerning the divine being, namely that there is in the divine being activity that is eternal, that does not depend on the world. The only theology that believes this is the Trinity. And this is literally the only one out there, you see. That's why we're unique. There is in this divine being, in this triad doctrine, an activity unique to our theology that teaches that it is not dependent on the existence of the world. There are conditions for its manifestation, right? Father, Son, and Spirit, in other words. Although an understanding of the triune God is exceptionally difficult, still an understanding of his bare unity is more difficult. In other words, we can't just believe in a single hypostasis. Besides its theoretical meaning, the doctrine of the Holy Trinity has an ethical meaning. Through the mystery of the Trinity, Christianity taught mankind not only to respect God with reverence, but also the doctrine of love, to love God. Through the mystery of the Holy Trinity, a new idea was disclosed, that God himself is love, most lofty and ideal love, an inexhaustible fountain of love. Augustine said, the mystery of the Christian Trinity is a mystery of divine love. If you see the Trinity, you see love. The mystery of the Trinity teaches us that divine love was manifested not only in the created order or in the contemplation of the created world, but that it appears in its most perfect, infinite fullness in the very bosom of the divinity. In other words, Father, Son, and Spirit, with the eternal movement and sharing of love, shows that our God, our view, is the only one that doesn't have a necessary created order to reflect it or to have love or to have honor or lordship. Any of the strict monotheistic positions require a world that God lords over or is God of. And the dyad systems don't work. What's your only other option? Triad. He goes on to say, the life of love resided from all eternity in God, the eternal communion of the love of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. Thus it can be asserted that the barren monotheism of all the ancient religions, not impregnated by the revealed truth of the Trinity, did not and could not have a true understanding of divine love. And by extension, it leads to a necessary creation, you see. The main distinction between the strict monotheism of contemporary Judaism and the Christian faith consists in the basic doctrine of divine unity and Trinity, right? The divine essence. Only in Christianity, through the revelation of Christ himself, do we understand and know that God is love. And only here do we know what love is. As expressed by Tolstoy, I wouldn't use Tolstoy, but God subordinated all the laws of Moses to the law of love. It was always the law of love, though, so we're going to bypass Tolstoy. To understand this idea of a God of love is impossible. It is impossible in barren monotheism. For whom did God love? Only himself. Only in the mystery of the Trinity does it initiate us into the complete profundity of divine unity. Divine unity being too vast for man's mind, it gives us to understand that divine love was never inactive. There wasn't a point when God didn't love, and then when he created the world, he began to love. Nope, we don't believe that. It never remained without manifestation because of the doctrine of eternal manifestation that's only taught in orthodoxy, by the way. There was never a pure self-love, but the Father always exteriorly loving the Son, and the Son exteriorly loving the Father and the Spirit, right? And thus pointing to the eternal divine communion of the persons of the Trinity. The complete depth of love of the divinity for the race of man is thus elucidated for us in the light of the most holy Trinity. The mystery is also the foundation of the whole teaching of the Christian doctrine of redemption. So what we see is that we are immediately forced to the doctrine of the Trinity. The Trinity is only taught in Christianity, and that leads us directly to the unique doctrines of Christianity. That's how we get from monad, dyad, triad. Again, there's no other systems that teach this, right? So there's no outs for the speculative atheists and the guys that are, well, what if I said this? What if I came up with this? Right? That doesn't work because those systems don't have any historical grounding. They don't exist. They're copy and paste jobs. You can't just make up a worldview. It doesn't work. But that's how the atheists and these guys think, because they collapse, as Kant did, what God does in our paradigm. They collapse it into the human mind, and thus the futility and stupidity of atheism. So, I think we were on 8 or 9. But that was the big meaty objection of how does it prove triad. So take all those arguments that I gave an hour ago about universals and how they interlock. Combine that with the last hour of what I argued for monad, dyad, triad, and what we just read from all of our theologians. Then you get our unique paradigm that ours is the true religion. There you go. A couple other kind of side objections that atheists might pull out. Remember Matt Dillahunty said, preconditions just are. I don't have to justify them. They just are. Again, Matt himself said, and many atheists say, you shouldn't believe in anything unless you have an empirical justification for that. And then Matt turns around and says, I have no empirical justification for preconditions. They just are. Those two things don't work. If I can have an ad hoc rescue, then I can just say, God is. I don't have to prove God. I don't have any arguments for God. God just is. Right? No atheist would allow me to do that. Matt, all of them, they would call me out. You can't do that. That's ad hoc. Dude, you just did that for preconditions. Okay? Therefore, that's not a good argument. It's not a good argument to just say, they just are. Just are what? Preconditions just are. Logic just is. As Father Deacon always says, just is what? What are you talking about? Like, you have a strict view of what you can say does and doesn't exist. Logic just is what? Is matter? Is a particular? Is a mental state? What? What is it? What is it that just is, you see? So we see that this bad argument of, well, preconditions just are. They just are what? They don't have to be justified. Says who? Right? It's you guys who say that you should only believe in things that are empirically demonstrable and justifiable. That's Matt's common, constant refrain. That's why he doesn't believe in God. Then he turns around and says that he has no problem believing in laws of logic and all these things that just are, that are not material, that can't be justified. That is a stupid contradiction. It's very simple. The argument is very simple. You got to be consistent on your paradigm with your own views. There you go. Another couple arguments that were made. You appeal to revelation and not to science and facts. Again, atheists in their paradigm are appealing to and believing in things that are not proven, known, or demonstrable by science and facts, right? This basic bitch scientism objection, one of the dumbest objections of all. You believe in things that are not justified by sense data, right? You actually believe in a bunch of superstitious things on your own worldview that you can't justify, right? To make a sentence, a simple sentence, as Frege says, requires a bunch of metaphysical things to be the case. None of those metaphysical things that have to be the case have been proven by you when you make a sentence, atheist, right? And so if that's the case, then they can't even make a sentence. That's how bad atheism is. You can't even make a sentence, bro. It's that bad. So when they do this stuff, when they do make a sentence, they say the cat exists, or the cat evolved, right? Some bullshit like this, right? The cat evolved. Let's use this as an example. The cat evolved, right? Mr. Atheist, don't you understand? As Frege pointed out, to make a sentence, multiple things have to be the case. That these symbols have meaning, that these symbols have a meaning that's invariant over time, that these symbols refer to abstract concepts, that abstract concepts can be related one to another, right? That they express truthful propositions and truth values. That this statement says something about things in the external world. That there's a sayer who's saying this, right? Some self, some person who has objective experiences of things in the external world. That universals are the case. All of these things are simple examples. I mean, and more, you could list more. You could keep going and listing more and more things that have to be the case just to say your dumb sentence. And you have not proven those things. They're assumed, they're preconditions. But remember, 99% of these goofballs believe that you should only accept what can be empirically demonstrated. That's all you can believe in. Really? All of those things that I listed for this sentence to be the case can't be empirically proven or demonstrated. You can't even make sentences. That's why tag is so devastating, because that's what tag is calling out. You need a paradigm and a bunch of things, preconditions, universals, etc., to be the case. Whole bunch of metaphysical things that you think are gobbledygook and magic that you can't prove to be the case to make a sentence. That is why this is nuclear strength apologetics, truly and genuinely. And that's why you're doing a disservice when you present Cameron and all those clowns bad arguments based on evidentialism. Okay, let's do the super chats. I've gone through, I think, 10 of them now. And if you have any more super chats, feel free to bring them forward now. My Hawaiian Shirt, $1. Jay Sniff versus Zizek Sniff. Truth is found in the cocaine that I do before the debate. How's that? Which is most powerful? Zizek's. He has the sniff of the gods. Jack, $3. Have you read Peripatetic? Would you recommend it? I have not. Thanks, Jay. $20. Thank you. Thanks, Jay. I appreciate those $20. Jordan. Yo, come on. Jordan's, dog. James, not James Jordan, Michael Jordan, $10, number 23. Shout out. What do you think of Jacob Boehme and Meister Eckhart? Those are medieval reactions to scholasticism. So if you go listen to the talk that I did on medieval heresy from the Malcolm Lambert book, I will discuss that. I think that Eckhart and Boehme are, we wouldn't follow them, but if you understand the problems of scholasticism, you could see why there would be the pendulum swing to the opposite extreme of mysticism. Noldor Apologist, $3. No question, I just wanted to say that I hope you find that book from John Frame useful. Yeah, I think so. I think Frame's History of Western Philosophy will have a lot of similar critiques to the kinds of things I would critique. Obviously, he's going to be screwed up when he tries to explain. He has no knowledge of Orthodox theology at all. He's operating within the presuppositions of absolute mind simplicity, so he will not be able to solve any of those dilemmas. But he will probably have, good critiques of a lot of these pagan paradigms. Mike Sherman, $20. Did John the Baptist know Jesus before he baptized him? Your thoughts? Going from memory off the top of my head, I think that John the Baptist knew he was preparing the way, but he seems to be shocked when, Jesus comes to him for baptism, and so he recognizes him. So I think he knew he had a mission. He knew because he leapt in the womb of his mother when Mary came to Elizabeth. So there was some mystical understanding that was present there, yes, I would say. Curtis, $2.18. Do you know anything about the self-inquiry practice? No, I don't. If so, what do you think of it? If not, check out Rupert Spira on YouTube. Okay, I don't know anything about that. I'll have to check out Rupert Spira. I don't see any Christians looking into exactly what it is. Thanks. Well, thank you, Curtis. I'll have to check that out. Torshon, $5. You are using sense data to justify your special pleading case that you aren't just as unjustified when you sense data validate scripture or transcendentals. Because I think this was one of the ones that somebody wanted me to cover, which was, I did have it listed down here at the bottom. Yeah, you're using sense data. So let's try to unpack this. You are using sense data to, okay, the problem with this objection is that everybody, no matter who your paradigm is, I can't think of a single worldview or paradigm that doesn't believe in some way that we use sense data. Like even the most radical idealist still believes that we're interacting with some kind of external data that's coming in the senses, right? So I've never heard of anybody objecting to this from somewhere. I mean, maybe there's some school that doesn't believe in sense data. I don't know, but I mean, I guess you could have like some radical evil demon position that says that there's no actual sense data. It's just an evil demon that's like literally, like programming and sending all the sense data into your head. But that's still sense data. Anyway, that's not the same thing as empiricism, right? So just because I believe in learning things through sense data doesn't mean that I restrict all knowledge to sense data. Okay, so empiricism is different from learning things empirically. Everybody in all known philosophies that I know of believes that we learn things empirically. But it doesn't follow that we only know, right, tabula rasa sense data or something like that. Right? We don't confine all knowledge to sense data as this empiricist school does. Okay? So the objection seems to come from the position of empiricism, as if everybody is stuck in a box of empiricism. And that if I make a transcendental argument or I appeal to scripture because that utilizes senses, that I'm appealing to sense data. So again, my argument is not of sense data itself, or that we are locked in everybody having to use sense data. My argument is against the empiricist system, or David Hume's argument that if you restrict knowledge to sense data, then you're stuck in the box. Okay? But we don't believe that. So our paradigm, our argument is not restricting things to sense data. And if somebody wants to counter that by saying, but that's all there is sense data, then you can't know that that's all that there is sense data. That's very simple, right? Very simple to counter that. So I think I'm responding to the objection, but it's a little unclear. You aren't just as unjustified when you use sense data to validate scripture or transcendental preconditions. Yeah, but I'm not restricting knowledge to sense data. I'm not an empiricist. So if he's trying to argue that actually everybody is an empiricist strictly, then I refute it with David Hume. Then knowledge is impossible. And since knowledge is not impossible, empiricism is not true. Slow Dog, $5. Have you heard the problem of evil argument concerning the existence of God? If you haven't, no problem. If you have, can you please refute it? Yeah, I mean, we've covered the problem of evil countless times. Only the Christian paradigm can actually give an account for how there is evil. So you need a standard of a benchmark, a standard to classify something as evil or good. That requires some abstract higher level categories of good and evil, of universals, of objective truths, value judgments. So if you don't have access to or belief in objective truths or the ability to make those kinds of value judgments, you gotta have a way to justify those assumptions, right? If I say something is good versus something not being not good, something evil, I'm utilizing universal categories, beliefs. I'm making value judgments on a universal scale. So the question is, how can you do that? You need a paradigm that gives you the ability to do that, for that to be a possibility. So again, we're at kind of preconditions. The good, you could say that the good is a kind of a precondition, right? To be able to make these kinds of assessments to judge good versus evil requires a precondition of the good. Now, only the Christian paradigm can ultimately give an account for that kind of stuff at a universal level. That's what we're saying. So when an atheist says the Christian system is evil because God allows evil, the first thing I would say is that in the Christian paradigm, God is not under any compulsion to have to tell you or me or anybody why he permits evil, right? Read the book of Job. There's no moral imperative upon God to have to reveal why he permits evil. Rather, the Christian paradigm is the only paradigm that does give an account for good and evil. Now, that doesn't mean, I know you're not going to accept that if you're an atheist. You go, oh, well, there's every other monotheistic position says that there's good and evil. Yeah, but I'm going to critique those other monotheistic positions the way that I just did when I talked about the Trinity. So we have to have the whole paradigm's got to be coherent, right? You can't just have parts and pieces here. But for an atheist to even say the Christian God is evil, he's assuming universal standards of goodness and evil, or benchmarks, you could say, a universal standard by which he can judge, but his worldview precludes the possibility of such a thing. I mean, the most he could say is, I don't like that God. He can't say that it's definitively, objectively wrong in an atheist paradigm, you see. So good and evil are paradigm level types of questions. So in order to say that Christianity can't deal with the problem of evil or theodicy is going to require a paradigm that has some basis or justification for benchmarks, for value judgments for good and evil. But no atheist position can give an account for that. That's not just rooted in subjectivism or pure relativism or personal taste, right? On what basis can an atheist say something's objectively wrong? Orthodox John, $20. Thank you for the streams, videos, essays, and other forms of content. Thank you very much, Orthodox John. I appreciate that $20. Ravens on the Wall, what's up? Shout out to the Discord, $5. Can you recap why transcendental categories are located in the divine mind rather than just in some particular mind, right? So if we think of what transcendental categories are, just like if we think about what types of things universals are, all right, let's look at, let's go ahead. If you have the Phaser book, I recommend chapter 3. It's really the only good chapter in the whole book. But chapter 3 is a good analysis of the question of universals. Okay, so if we were to boil down universals, numbers, laws of logic, right, and we could include preconditions or transcendental categories in the same type of class of stuff, I would argue. Some people might take issue with that, but I think they're all kind of in the same boat, in the same ball. Let's use the big popcorn ball analogy here. We're going to make a popcorn ball. We're going to stick all of these types of things together. Let's put numbers, concepts, universals, preconditions, laws of logic, you could, if you wanted to, we can put possible worlds in here for the sake of argument, if we want to, just to be really thorough. This is our big popcorn ball, right? We're going to take all of these types of things, the numbers, the concepts, the preconditions, the laws of logic, the possible worlds, the universals, right? These are all these unique types of things that we pointed out that are not reducible to matter. We don't exactly know what these are in the sense of like, give me some exhaustive definition of what a universal is. Nobody can do that, right? That's like a lot of times atheists will try to pull this trick where they're like, if you don't give me like a perfect, omniscient, exhaustive definition of what a universal is, I won't accept it. Nobody can do that, and nobody expects that of anybody. So that's like a trick that they play. Now, what I'm saying is that all of these unique abstract types of things, which are preconditioned, they have to be the case. Remember, they don't operate in a vacuum. There's no numbers that exist apart from universals, right? Universals don't exist apart from preconditions for the possibility of speaking or communication or language, right? Those don't exist apart from concepts, right? There's a logic, an order to concepts and language, right? They operate in tandem with the laws of logic. These things operate in tandem with preconditions for predication, speech, communication, and language. Now, if we think about all of these, as Phaser notes, as interlocking, how can this be? How do we justify the big popcorn ball of these things? How do we make sense of that? So now, again, if you remember from the beginning of the chat, we were looking at lower order logic, higher order logic. Now we're moving it at one meta step higher. We're moving up another step, and we're saying we got all these types of things that are preconditions for lower order statements, sentences, knowledge. How do we justify these? There's nothing wrong with asking that question, right? Because we're saying that all knowledge claims to have the possibility of knowledge rests on these things being the case as preconditions. So all the more do we need to give a justification or a grounding or explain how these things are. Well, there's not a whole lot of things that can work to string all of these pearls together, to make all these things cohere and to ground them and to give them sense and coherence. Now, if we have a divine mind, well, what do you know? That just perfectly seems to work, doesn't it? Right? An omniscient mind, by the way, not just a force, but a personal being. An omniscient mind can unify and ground and, you could say, locate these types of things, right? And make them work, so to speak. The mind of God is where you could say these things are patterned and located, if you want to, just to be simple. God's mind, because he's omniscient, because he's omnipotent, he's omnipresent. He is how these things are universally the case. They're invariant, and how they apply to the temporal here and the now, because the created world is patterned on the logi, patterned on these things in the divine mind. God is the substrate. The divine mind is the superstructure that houses, strings together, interlocks, and makes all these cohere. So in other words, God is the precondition for the preconditions. That's the argument. Now you could say, well, what if I believe in a God who's omniscient but isn't omnipresent? Well, that wouldn't work. All the omnis go together. Okay, so you're not going to be able to deny one of the omnis or deny that he's a personal God and have that work, right? Because you need to relate those things to this world. This world can't be eternal matter. It's got to be a created world. That's the Christian paradigm we're saying. Now enters in all of those unique distinctions of Orthodox theology and Maximus's teaching, logos logi. Now we get specified in terms of how that theology answers those higher order dilemmas or problems that we might run into, right? Because if we've got the argument to this point, somebody would say, well, okay, well, maybe I accept all that, but what about, why can't I just be a Platonist? What if I... So now we would look at the problems in Platonism and how Platonism and why Maximus modifies Neoplatonism and the Logi doctrine to be a specifically personal God. That's where we get to the really difficult, the final problems in this. Now, I'm not going to tell everybody that they need to read this, but basically, in order to avoid the problems of Neoplatonism, or the last refuge perhaps. Well, maybe I believe all this, but creation is an eternal generation. No, this negates the possibility of knowledge. We need creation to be a real potentia in God. We need the created world to be done on the basis of God's free will, hence the essence-energy distinction. You can't have free will in God without potentia and energeia and free will. God has the real potentia to create and not necessarily to actualize all of his potentia. And we need a God who is not equated to or identified with the world, but yet at the same time is the basis for the world, hence the orthodox doctrine of the energies, all of which solves a lot of these basic fundamental philosophical problems, right? We don't have the ADS dialectical problems of Roman Catholicism. Thus, orthodoxy is unique, right? It alone presents the theological truths, triad in its pure form, which solves all of these philosophical problems and dilemmas. Why does man have all these problems and philosophical dilemmas? Because he won't believe and rejects the true God. That's why. Bob Marley, $5. Jay, how do we know evil is evil and good is good? By the argument I gave earlier about good and evil. Bob Marley, $5. Thank you for the stream. Thank you, Bob Marley. Mon. Thank you, Mon. No woman, no cry. All right. 2 hours, 30 minutes. Hopefully we have dispelled some of the common objections. I'm sure there's more. There's others. Oh, what if I don't believe that transcendental arguments are valid? What if, there's always going to be more. You could go that route if you wanted to, although I think that leads to a lot of just silly absurdities. First of all, on what basis, just because I talk about higher order meta level argumentation, are you going to then say that all meta arguments are invalid? I mean, who really believes that? Maybe somebody does. I don't know, but I don't really think that's even worth dealing with. But in terms of the original disjunctive that I gave, what's invalid about that? How is that invalid? X is the necessary precondition of Y. Y, therefore X. What? How is that invalid? Right, so if you're going to reject transcendental arguments, how is that not valid, right? All right, so I hope you guys enjoyed it. Hopefully we cleared up some of the basic mistakes and misunderstandings. A lot of people said, you've never shown exactly how this relates to... And by the way, more has to be said. I understand. More needs to be explained about the logi and how that's different from Platonic divine conceptualism. But what I presented to you is you could call it a St. Maximus version of divine conceptualism. Okay? Nothing wrong with the term divine conceptualism. I'm just making the transcendental argument couched in the framework of divine conceptualism and not in the Augustinian scheme, but rather in the scheme of St. Maximus, right? More can be said on this if you read my essay, Numbers Prove God, where I get into the section where Stephen Clark talks about Maximus's view of the incarnation. That will all be in the book that we do with Father Deacon that will eventually come out. So anyway, God bless everybody. Hopefully this is helpful.